All right, thank you, Meredith, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate you all sticking it out. We are going to jump right back into this conversation. I think we've heard a lot about how spectrum and infrastructure are very important to 5G, and I think it makes sense to just drill down a little bit more on those topics. So I wanted to start with spectrum. The FCC has been making some news on that recently. So let's just talk a little bit about, first, how the FCC is doing on spectrum and where you think there needs to be action the fastest.
Well, I think we certainly welcome the FCC's moves recently to get us more 5G spectrum, started in 2016. The recent announcement to have the auction for millimeter waves in November this year, very timely. If you go back to how we won the race for 4G, that was because the FCC released a lot of spectrum in PCS and AWS and 700, right? So absolutely the right thing to do. We welcome that, and I think for all of us on this panel, there's no such thing as too much spectrum.
Thanks, Rachel. You want to?
No, yeah. Again, I commend the FCC for making the move to make spectrum available. I think what you've heard, again, we would all like more. I think the only other comment I'll add as we think about the global space is what we do with 3.5 and possibly some revised rules around the paths associated with 3.5 would probably be the only thing I will add to the conversation we've had about millimeter wave, low band, and mid band.
I agree. The millimeter wave, like I said on the talk, was lightning speed. Would love to see that repeated in the mid band area. Because I think if you look at the comparison that I think one of the presenters have put together from a global perspective, you clearly see that when it comes to 5G, everybody else around the world seems to believe that it's a combination of millimeter wave and midband to get that going. And right now, I think we got the millimeter wave side addressed, and I think we need to do a bit more on the midband side so that they can be paired together. And CBRS is one of those areas.
I think the only thing to add is that when new spectrum is brought to the market, you have to do it the right way. And the millimeter wave, I think, is a great example. There are many, many bands under discussion or under consideration. It's not just one or two bands. And you could do this a couple of different ways. You can just have an auction every month or every couple of months, one after the other, which is going to make it very, very difficult for us, the operators, to get ready for those things, plan for those things, and just be able to participate in a meaningful manner. Whereas you may want to take, the other approach would be just to take a little bit of more time, try to bundle a couple of these or many of these bands into one auction so that we have a meaningful, swath of spectrum that will be brought to the market at any given point in time, and then we kind of have a readiness to start deploying 5G on top of that. We can do the development in a more coordinated manner. And I'm hoping it's more the latter than the former, because just because we have a lot of spectrum and many, many auctions, that doesn't mean that it makes it easy on our side to absorb that spectrum and those auctions. So you have to try to do it the right way. And other than that, the 3.5 gig or the mid-band spectrum in general, I don't think we can emphasize it too much that it is extremely important that we find a significant amount of spectrum in that space to really stimulate 5G and adoption of those new capabilities that it promises us.
Well, Kari, I want to follow up on that just a little bit. Commissioner Rosenworcel recently talked about a spectrum calendar so that providers know when auctions might be. Do you see benefits to that? Do you think that's something that the FCC should take up?
Well, I think it's good because then it allows us to have a discussion and provide feedback, whether that makes sense, whether you need to tweak it a little, whatever it may be. I don't see a problem with that. I think it's good if we have more transparency, heads up. Absolutely, I think that would be a welcome thing to do.
I mean, I think one of the things I would add is, I think Kari's trying to say this also, that sometimes complexity is more of a problem than just the timing, right? So getting it out there is one thing, but if you make it too complex, we touch on a lot about geography sizes and things like that. If it's like playing Go, with the kind of spectrum auctions, then it gets very complicated for everybody involved. So some level of simplicity, I think, is going to go a long way.
Rachel, did you want to add something?
No, I think we're off to a good start, and I will echo the comments made. I think the work we have going, having some transparency to timing and the simplification of that would definitely be helpful from a deployment perspective.
Well, on some of the complexity, let's talk a little bit more on 3.5. There's debate right now about the sizes of the licenses in that band. I'm curious, do you see industry moving towards a compromise on those licenses, and how important is it to get there to get an auction scheduled? I don't know if Rachel, would you like to?
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely worth the discussion to coalesce as an industry around what those rules should be and get into a point where we can move forward and actually use the spectrum sooner is better than later, right? And so that'll take some dialogue on our part and some, partnering and working with the policy community to make that happen. So yes.
Look, I've always said spectrum is a national resource, right? So the last thing you want is spectrum sitting around and not being used. So 3.5 is one of those things that I think can be leveraged in many ways, because the usability today in the government sector is not as frequent as one would like to see from a spectrum usage perspective. So I think you always need to go and start from where else can we do something like that, and if we have to share it is one thing, it's fine. But if you make the geography extremely small, to go back to that whole auction discussion, so everybody would have to create a map to kind of think, if I only got one dot and then 5 other ones outside of it, or 3 or 4 of them versus the 2 around it, you have to change the entire dynamics of the auction. That is a pretty complex set of auction rules for you to deal with, not to mention the interference control that you have to deal with after the fact as well. So I can't predict things in this town like anybody can, obviously, but I would hope that the logic and the way in which we operate would prevail at the end.
And I think there's also an often missed fact that these license sizes, especially the smaller they are, the higher the complexity associated with deployment is. And what I mean by that is that every license, obviously, there's a geographical boundary between licenses. And RF tends to radiate all over the place, right? So if you have to protect your neighbors and make sure that you don't interfere with them, and those license areas are really, really small, that's going to reduce the utility of that spectrum over time, and it's going to create a coordination challenge between having multiple neighbors around you. And so there are valid reasons why, valid technical reasons and concerns too, why, this is an important discussion to have. And yes, you have to find, a balance and something that works for everyone, but it is not just a question of, license prices or sizes just for the sake of it. It's also a question of how do we make sure that the spectrum gives us what we expect from it? How do we make sure that we maximize the utility of that particular scarce resource?
So just to add something controversial.
Great.
The 3.5 band in the United States is, the fact that we already have CBRS that is not particularly 5G friendly makes it a challenge. I think that's what everybody's trying to talk towards, is that if you're trying to build an ecosystem that has global scale, then you would want to actually adopt a 3.5 format that has global scale. So I think that's a lot of complexity and a lot of ramifications for the whole industry and how we work through that. Just from Sprint's experience, we do have a lot of mid-band spectrum at 2.5, but again, if you look at how the 2.5 ecosystem is built, it's built on the foundation of a global ecosystem. It was not until China Mobile adopted band 41 that it actually took off, because they have gazillions of customers, right? So look at that as a lessons learned and look at 3.5. I think it needs to be on a global format in order for us to get an ecosystem big enough to drive it.
And Jen, I just want to follow up with you on 2.5, because I know that Chairman Pai in a post yesterday talked about making some changes in 2.5. I'm not sure if, I think the proposal was just made public today, so it might be jumping the gun a little bit, but what opportunities do you see there for Sprint?
I think we applaud Chairman Pai's move. Certainly much needed. What he is proposing, and I have to read the full order in detail, like you say, it just came out. I think it allows basically a lot of white spaces in rural markets that is unused right now. A lot of the EBS band at 2.5. It actually allows the current EBS holders to expand the boundaries. And essentially, it's good for the U.S. Consumer because it allows us to now offer services in those white space areas. So absolutely, we applaud that, and we think it's extremely timely. It's going to strengthen our position on 2.5. It gives us an opportunity to build out those rural areas where currently those spectrum is unused.
Great. Other opportunities for, I guess, Verizon or AT&T in 2.5?
I'm sorry.
Do you think you have opportunities in that 2.5 band as well, or what?
I would
given
say
the
that
proposal?
much like the discussion we had about the complexity of interference and things like that in a band, is similar kind of discussions, and it depends on what the outcome, I would say, of the NPRM would look like for it to really be used. But I would say in today's environment of that, it's pretty close to CBRS if you think about it.
I would agree.
Okay. Before we move off of midband, I do want to touch base on 3.7 and what opportunities there may be there. I don't know if you guys see that moving forward this year at all. I do want to.
Again, I would start with predicting in this town is very difficult to do. So I'm not going to go to the prediction side as a conversation. But I would also go back to similar to the starting point of all spectrum really need to be better used. And in that particular band, I do think that there are opportunities that is not being fully utilized today. And I do think that some action would be good to actually make that more available to be used for mobility, because foundationally, if you look at all the charts from a usage perspective, if you were to compare the amount of spectrum that's being made available for the mobile operators versus that of some of the other places, you would say that that's probably off kilter to the fact that a lot of that should be shifted towards active use in the mobile space.
And I think the good news also is that if you look at what that spectrum is being used for, like for satellite downlinks and fixed links, there are alternatives. So it's not like you're trying to solve an unsolvable problem. Mm-hmm. Is it easy? Probably not. Will it take time? Your guess is as good as mine. But I think we're going to have to work on that hard together to try to find solutions that allow us to bring that spectrum to the market, and not just a little bit of it, but hopefully a lion's share, if not all of that. But I think it's just a question of, going through the dialogue on finding what is the best way forward. How do you, crack that nut in the best efficient way?
Yeah, and I think this is where, the conversation about the calendar, just to tie back to that, right, is really understanding how we as a collective industry, collective nation expect this to evolve is important for planning purposes, and how we think about engineering and deploying networks. So I think, where that slots, what's the timing of that is, we'll have to work on that, but I think it's important to at least get the calendar and at least have the conversation around what bands we're talking and what time frame.
Yeah, and Rachel, AT&T pitched as a design proposal for an auction, I believe in the 39 band, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and why the company's interested in this band in particular.
Well, I think the 39 band just goes along with the millimeter wave strategy in general, and our ability to get these 100 megahertz wider channels to provide service, whether it's speed and how we densify an area. So I think that's just important to us as a band. The second comment I'll make is just as we're thinking about the evolution of the global ecosystem, right? And our ability to be, play and provide services wherever our customers may be, that band becomes important to us. So,
I definitely agree that we need to repack a band so that we can make the best use of it. It's definitely the right thing to do. And I would say that the second point I would make is that it's probably best to have some of these things done before the auction, so that we can actually have these things packed up beforehand, so that a commercial solution takes place even before the auction. Because it's back to the complexity issue, right? You don't want to go into a complex way of auctioning it.
Yeah, I think the ability to pack and kind of get contiguous, and to actually, as we talk about in different bands, the coordination efforts of your neighbors, and we can do that. We know as an industry how to do that. But actually kind of containing that, I'll say, is to everybody's advantage.
And I agree. I mean, that repacking needs to take place. don't know how complicated it'll end up being, or whether it'll be a fast process or a slow process. If it does end up taking time, I think we should be open to, because there is a portion of that band, the 37 gig band, at least a lion's share of that 1 gig, that's kind of free and clear, if you will. We should look at maybe auctioning that off, not to hold back if the process of repacking the rest of the licenses takes time. I don't know how it's going to end up, but I think that's one of those things that sometimes there are opportunities that are not apparent on the surface.
I think the clear message from millimeter wave in general is that I think we would really like the FCC to move faster on not just 28, but 24, 37, and 39 as well. And also to give us a predictability in terms of, so that we can then start planning for the markets as well as the products that we need. Rather than do it in drips and drops, at least for Sprint, we would like to see basically a more aggressive move and freeing up more spectrum in those bands, and not just start with one at a time.
Okay, I think we should switch gears from spectrum and get into a little bit of the discussion on infrastructure. Even though I think we could just keep talking about spectrum for a while, we should talk about infrastructure a little bit too. John, I wanted to start with you. You talked a little bit about the small cell streamlining move that the FCC made on the historic and environmental reviews. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have for Sprint on build out in this year and next year? How does that change things?
I think this year alone, the recent FCC move to reform the environmental and historic reviews process is absolutely going to help in terms of not just in cost, but also in terms of time. I think I mentioned in my speech earlier, the last 2 years we've paid $20 million in historical review fees that other industries didn't have to pay on the same pole. So this levels the playing field. It also allows us to move fast, the whole industry, not just Sprint, in terms of being able to get this small cells deployed a lot faster than the 12 months to 18 months. So absolutely we applaud the move, very timely, and we look forward to more streamlining of the whole processes if we really want to win the global race.
And did it change your deployment plans at all for this year or next? Or
well, I think it has done so. It actually speeds up the schedule to get all our small cells built. It makes it more predictable, and that's why we keep working with the FCC and the CTIA to make sure that for the sake of all of us, we want a more streamlined approach, a more predictable process, and reasonable fees to get small cells and actually attachments to any public infrastructure done faster at a reasonable pace.
Yeah, so definitely commend. I mean, we started our CRAN bill about 2 years ago in San Francisco, and as we have rolled that out around the country, and then now we have the movement from the FCC, we expect to see those timelines improve, which then means more sales come on air faster than we'd anticipated. And so I think it's a great move. And as we see more in the space of how we can get more efficient and cost-effective infrastructure processes would be great.
I think the only thing I would add is that sometimes it's tough already to deal with all of the municipalities that somebody mentioned earlier, but I think some municipalities doesn't remember, I believe one of the congresswomen had talked about the fact that it's not about the revenue side, but it is about digitizing your municipality and bringing new jobs and bringing new capabilities to your citizens there. I think sometimes if they have looked at it through that particular lens, I believe that the conversation about fees and attachment rates and stuff like that would be very different. So I think if that particular conversation can shift towards, hey, this is not about how much we pay you, but how much we're bringing the technology to your community would be a great way to go about it.
Absolutely, Ed. And I don't think anyone in this panel here is asking for a free ride to use public infrastructure. What we're asking for is predictable, reasonable access at reasonable timeframes with reasonable fees so that we can all prosper together as we build the infrastructure that would disrupt a lot of industries and bring in jobs and allow us to lead.
Yeah, Kari, I wanted to ask you I guess, looking what's in the FCC's pipeline on infrastructure, what do you think is the top change that they could make this year on infrastructure for 5G?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point to look at the environmental and historical review processes for small cells in particular. But there will be other types of deployments as well. And I think you need to look at this deployment challenge or deploying infrastructure holistically across the board. And it's going to apply in the macro space as much in the small cell space. It's also related to facilities and backhaul. So it's really an end-to-end or like a 360 challenge that we have ahead of us. And good moves have been made, steps to the right direction, but that doesn't mean that the work is over. And then it's not just, I think it was mentioned, it's not just on the federal level, but it's also on the municipal level. How do we streamline, align those processes so that you don't have to deal with, what was the number in Dallas, 70 or whatever, different types of municipalities just to be able to deploy. That is hard,
Oh,
I mean, I think sometimes municipalities also don't have the resources either. Remember when we did the shot clock stuff on the macro stuff? I think similar approach can happen, but I also think the municipalities sometimes when it comes to the actual reviews of these kind of permits and things like that, they also need some help too. So I believe there's a little bit of that that can be a two-way street.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in making sure the process isn't just, it's advantageous for the ecosystem. The amount of volume that we're talking about here across the country, across the nation, our ability to educate, enable the municipalities to handle that type of work and volume at speed. I mean, scale is going to matter, and the policies and processes that also help them see the digitalization and help them to understand here are the benefits. But there's a lot of volume coming at them, and so it's probably somewhat overwhelming for them as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I don't know, how do you solve that problem of you have one city worker handling, all of a sudden they're getting hundreds of small cell permits?
Well, I mean, we could do some standardization of things, right? I mean, there are certain things that like we said before, right? When we were in zoning meetings getting asked for small cells, these are generally what small cells look like, then maybe they don't have to do the same kind of process every one of the time, right?
All right, well, we're getting short on time, but there was one question I want to ask. Each of your companies has a different vision for 5G, fixed or mobile or both in some cases. But one thing I am curious about is 5G deployment in rural areas. And when you're talking about densifying in a city, that makes sense. But how do you make sure that parts of the country where there's a lower population density don't get left behind?
Absolutely. So I think the vision of 5G is not just for urban markets or the big markets. Absolutely, I think we view 5G as an opportunity to close the digital divide. And one of the things with 5G, because of the increased spectral efficiency, the improvement that we expect to see, the cost to deliver a bit is going to drop significantly from 4G. So if you look at it from a purely economical point of view, I think 5G. That's why some of my fellow panelists here are looking at fixed wireless with 5G potentially to disrupt the wireline industry, because they can do it if the cost points are right. And you have a better shot at doing that with 5G, with better economics than 4G. And clearly for the rural markets, if you look at it from a purely economic point of view, I think 5G is a better tool for us to cover the rural markets and close the digital divide.
Yeah, I think as we think about the technology, think about the things we've heard today, to think about the things we're planning for, it really is an ecosystem that's everywhere that we're trying to enable. And so the timing, the service, those things will continue to have our strategies around. But when you think about whether it's urban or rural, 5G gives us the tools and building platforms that enable us to provide service everywhere we decide. And we get to decide, and to the point, we don't know all the services that'll come. Some of those will be, they'll all be available to everybody. Some of them will be more economical in rural versus urban and vice versa. But the platform has to be built, and 5G as a network has to be built to enable all of that. And that's why you hear us talk about millimeter wave and low band, right? That we could actually get coverage and get services everywhere.
I would put it in a couple of ways. Number one, if you look at the way in which we build out from 3G to 4G, the rural markets didn't get left behind either. We're talking about building where the most of the usage is. I mean, that's generally how things get done. So it's a matter of time, not because of a matter of if. So I think that's number one. There's some misnomer in that case. Secondarily, similar to how I talked about the band gets changed over eventually and convert into become everybody's band, the 700 megahertz, 850 megahertz, they'll all become 5G spectrum at some point as well. So, you know, that's the kind of way that eventually you get there, and the mid-band would help as well. So I don't think it's a debate of the fact that the rural markets would be left out because they didn't get left out in 4G either. So I think it's just a matter of timing and the way in which the spectrum get repurposed for use.
And not every 5G application requires ultra-high gigabit speeds, but every 5G application requires connectivity and coverage. That was the first lesson I learned as a young RF engineer, was no signal, no service. And that applies in the 5G world as well. So we do need nationwide coverage. We do need coverage in rural areas as well to enable many of these applications. Think about, you know, connected vehicle, for example. Would you like to only drive around the block, you know, in your neighborhood, or maybe go out to the countryside as well? And the answer is, of course, I want that to be, you know, everywhere. Or a lot of these IoT applications, so ability to track things. So yes, nationwide coverage and ability to provide services is equally important in rural areas as it is in urban areas. Absolutely. And I don't think, just like with LTE, I think Ed said it well, you know, that will happen, that we'll kind of just focus on specific geographies and forget what's out there.
All right, thank you. Thank you all thank you to my panelists for your expertise and insight, and thank you to the audience for your attention.
Thank you.